The courtroom was filled with quiet tension. Cameras were rolling. Reporters whispered to each other, waiting for something, anything that might become tomorrow's headline. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Margaret Holloway stared. Down from her bench, her sharp glasses resting halfway down her nose, she looked straight at the defense table. "Miss Bondi," she said coldly, "this court has rules against visible religious displays during proceedings." All eyes turned to Pam Bondi. She sat tall in a navy blue blazer, her blonde hair pulled back neatly. She was calm, unbothered. A small gold cross, thin and barely visible, rested just below the collar of her jacket. "Your Honor," Pam said, softly but clearly, "this cross was my mother's. She wore it every day until the day she died. She gave it to me before she passed." Judge Holloway narrowed her eyes. "This is not about personal meaning. This is about legal protocol. Remove it or I will issue a fine." Pam didn't move. Instead, she gently touched the cross with her fingertips. The courtroom grew silent, except for the sound of cameras clicking. "With all due respect," she said, her southern accent smooth but firm, "if this cross offends the court's sensibilities, then maybe the court's sensibilities need a second look." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the court clerk looked stunned. Judge Holloway's face turned a shade darker. She picked up her gavel and struck it down hard. $500, she said. "Contempt of court." A few people in the gallery cheered softly, mostly reporters and a few politically vocal spectators. Others remained still, unsure if they were witnessing a legal moment or the start of something much bigger. Pam Bondi didn't react to the fine. She reached slowly into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed leather folder. It looked old, maybe untouched for years. She held it in both hands, looked at the judge, then turned to face the gallery behind her. "This isn't just about a necklace," she said, her voice now louder, steadier. "This is about who gets to speak freely in this country and who gets told to sit down and shut up." The cameras zoomed in. "This document," she continued, holding up the sealed folder, "was written during a time when I worked for the Department of Justice on something classified. Very few people know about it, but it matters now. Because today, in this courtroom, a quiet little rule about dress code is being used to silence something much larger." Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Miss Bondi, I suggest you stop right there." Pam held her ground. "I haven't even started." In the gallery, journalists began texting editors. One reporter from an international outlet leaned toward her cameraman and whispered, "This is going global." Pam looked back at the judge. "I understand the law. I understand court rules. But I also understand the Constitution. And if I have to stand here alone with nothing but my mother's cross and this folder, I will. Because silencing one voice, even with something as small as a fine, is the first step toward silencing a nation." She paused, then placed the sealed folder on the defense table. "This is not just about me," she said. "This is about all of us." The judge didn't respond. The courtroom was silent. A storm had just begun, and everyone could feel it. And Pam Bondi had just fired the first strike. The courtroom remained frozen. For a few seconds, even the buzzing of phones and the scribbling of reporters seemed to stop. Pam Bondi stood still, her hand resting on the sealed leather folder she had just placed before her. Across the room, Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses again and gave a quick glance to her bailiff. "Miss Bondi," the judge said, attempting to reclaim control, "if you wish to submit a motion, follow proper court procedure. This is not a political stage." Pam didn't flinch. She slowly took her seat but kept her voice steady. "With respect, Your Honor, this is not politics. This is precedent." From the press row, a legal correspondent from CNN whispered into her mic, "This just turned from courtroom drama into a national moment." Pam gently opened the leather folder. Inside were several documents sold, stamped, and clearly official. One was labeled Confidential Doge Archive. 1998. Another bore the seal of the U.S. Senate. She pulled out the first paper and began reading. In 1998, while working with the Department of Justice on national security cases, I helped draft and revise portions of Florida's interpretation of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This court fined me for wearing a religious symbol yet. Under Statute 761.03. The state must demonstrate a compelling interest to restrict any religious expression and do so in the least restrictive way possible. Judge Holloway leaned forward. You're citing an outdated statute in an unrelated case. Pam shook her head. That statute has never been repealed. And more importantly, there is precedent, both federal and state, that allows for symbolic religious expression unless it disrupts the proceeding. The judge tried to interrupt, but Pam's voice got louder. There was no disruption until you created one. There was a soft gasp from the gallery. The judge's gavel slammed again, but even that sound now seemed less commanding than it had just minutes earlier. Judge Holloway narrowed her eyes. You're dangerously close to crossing a line, Miss Bondi. Pam looked directly at her. I've crossed many lines in my career. Your Honor, Afghanistan, Moscow, classified briefings in underground rooms. So forgive me if I don't shake when I cross one in a courtroom where the law is already on my side. The room exploded with murmurs. A Fox News anchor looked up from his notes and whispered to his producer, She's not bluffing. Check her DOJ record. Fast. Suddenly, a young man in a gray suit entered the courtroom. He handed a note to one of the judge's clerks, who whispered something quickly into Holloway's ear. The judge's face turned pale for a moment, then hardened. She cleared her throat. Miss Bondi, please submit all supporting documentation. Formally, this proceeding is paused until further review. Pam remains seated. Calm. Of course, I'm just getting started. As the courtroom slowly emptied for the recess, a political commentator tweeted from the back. Bondi just exposed more than a courtroom policy. She exposed a political fault line in American justice. Something deeper is coming. Back in the hallway, the cameras crowded around Pam. She ignored the shouted questions and simply held up the sealed folder. This file, she said quietly, is not about a necklace. It's about something. That was buried, and I have every intention of digging it up. At the far end of the hallway, a man in a dark overcoat watched silently. No press noticed him, but Pam did. Her expression changed, just slightly. A ghost from her past had just arrived. Outside the courtroom, the air was heavy with noise-flashing cameras. Political commentators shouting into microphones, protesters waving signs about religious freedom, and reporters jostling for position. Pam Bondi stood calmly in the center. Of it all, her small gold cross still resting just below her collar, catching the light. She looked like a woman in control. But inside, she felt the tremor of something bigger approaching. She hadn't expected to see him again. The man in the dark overcoat, now leaning casually against a pillar, had once worked in the same counterintelligence unit she had served in during her early DOJ years. He hadn't aged much, just traded his military cut for gray at the temples. His name was Thomas Vance, and his presence here meant trouble. As Bondi walked past the press toward the elevator, she heard his voice low and even, just like she remembered. You should have left this buried, Pam. She stopped, but didn't turn. You knew I wouldn't. Now she turned to face him. His eyes scanned the crowd as if they were all background noise. You really want to do this in the open? On live TV? She didn't blink. The courtroom fired the first shot. The elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. Before it closed, she added quietly, You should get your files ready. They'll be subpoenaed next. Back upstairs, Judge Holloway sat in her chambers, red-faced, pacing. Her law clerk, a recent Harvard grad named Ava Chen, was watching a live stream of CNN's legal coverage. The commentary wasn't in the judge's favor. They're calling it a constitutional crisis, Ava said softly. Bondi's legal interpretation is airtight. Even the ACLU is backing her. The judge snapped. Enough. But her fingers were trembling. The fine she issued wasn't just about the cross. It was about shutting down what she thought was a PR stunt. But now it was unraveling. Her clerk cleared her throat, and there's more. Bondi's team just submitted a request to unseal 2 classified memorandums, dated 2002 and 2006, one signed by you. The judge went silent. Those documents had nothing to do with religion. They had to do with covert judicial cooperation during the early years of the Patriot Act cases that were sealed to hide illegal wiretaps and closed-door military detentions. Bondi had been on the team that helped hide the paper trail. And apparently, she'd kept copies. The legal trap wasn't about a fine. It was about leverage. Meanwhile, in a quiet studio not far from Capitol Hill, a live interview was about to begin. A major investigative show had just booked Pam Bondi. The producer, a woman named Sophia Cortez, gave her a final note. Stay calm, stay sharp. The public's with you for now. Pam nodded, clipped her mic, and sat down. The lights came. On Pam Bondi, the anchor began. Today you defied a federal judge over a small piece of jewelry. But the real storm seems to be just beginning. Tell us, what are you really fighting? Pam looked straight into the camera. I'm fighting for the truth. The law should protect our rights, not be used to erase them. And when the justice system starts punishing faith instead of defending, someone has to ask why. The anchor leaned in, and the sealed documents your team is preparing to unsealed. Do they have anything to do with Judge Holloway's past rulings? Bondi answered carefully. Let's just say, some judges forget the law they swore to uphold. Others remember it in time. I'm hoping she's the second kind. As the camera zoomed out and the network cut to commercial, social media exploded. Hashtag Bondi vs. Holloway, hashtag judicial crisis, hashtag freedom on trial, but in a cold room below the courthouse. Someone else was watching. Surveillance feed showed Bondi's interview. A man in a military uniform sat in front of it, arms crossed. He turned to a second screen and pulled up her DOJ personnel file. She still has the clearance, he muttered. Another officer looked over. You think she'd go public? The man nodded. Not just public, she'd go nuclear. He reached for a red file labeled Operation Vigilance Deep Seal. It hadn't been touched in 17 years. That was about to change. The sealed courtroom documents arrived by armored courier just after sunrise. Inside the federal clerk's office, 3 agents signed off in silence, ignoring the curious glances from the staff. The files weren't marked confidential or even classified. They were marked sealed by executive order. Meant no leaks, no scans, and no second chances. But someone had already seen them. Pam Bondi had reviewed the contents 2 nights ago in a secure underground room below her legal team's headquarters. As she turned the yellowing pages, the weight of the words pressed against her spine like cold steel. There it was, Judge Margaret. Holloway's signature, proving undisclosed surveillance operations targeting U.S. citizens under the Patriot Act's earliest legal stretch. Among the names on the list, journalists, pastors, even a few senators. One name, however, struck deeper than all the others. Martha Louise Bondi, Pam's mother, the one who gave her the cross. And suddenly, everything clicked. That morning, Judge Holloway appeared on a national news segment attempting to regain control of the narrative. Her tone was calm, almost maternal. It's not mistake grandstanding for justice, she told the anchor. Ms. Bondi is politicizing courtroom procedure to stir division. That cross may be symbolic, but the courtroom must remain neutral ground. The host, clearly coached, nodded. But what about the allegations tied to your past rulings, Judge? Holloway smiled faintly. Baseless. Old cases misinterpreted. And I trust the American public knows better than to fall for conspiracy theater. Backstage, Holloway's aide was white as a sheet. His phone had just buzzed with a private server. Alert. Pam Bondi's legal team is preparing a press conference with documentation. Expect fallout. Across town, Bondi was already standing before a podium outside the National Archives. Dozens of cameras pointed at her. She held up the sealed file. "This," she said calmly, "is the truth the system buried." Documents signed by judges, including Margaret Holloway. That greenlit illegal surveillance on U.S. citizens without warrants. Citizens like my mother. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Bondi's voice cracked just slightly. "My mother was a civil rights attorney. She led peaceful protests. She never committed a crime. But she wore a cross. She spoke up, and she got flagged." Silence fell. She raised the file again. "The same judge who fined me for a cross around my neck once authorized the federal tracking of Americans like my mother for wearing theirs." Journalists fired off questions like gunshots. Will you file ethics charges? Is Judge Holloway facing removal? Is this religious discrimination or political retaliation? Bondi didn't answer. She stepped aside and let her lead counsel, an ex-federal prosecutor named Malik Ortega, take the mic. Ortega's words were sharp. "We are filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Oversight Committee, requesting a federal inquiry into Judge Holloway's conduct over a 15-year span. If there's one system that should be accountable, it's the one that claims to uphold justice." The crowd erupted. In a private, windowless meeting room beneath the Justice Department, an emergency session was underway. 4 senior officials, 3 federal judges, and 1 grim-faced intelligence liaison sat around a black glass table. "Bondi just triggered something we buried deep," one official said. "You all know what vigilance was?" One of the judges, older, nervous, whispered. "You mean surveillance of religious leaders post 9/11s? The intelligence officer stood slowly. "No, not just religious leaders, entire communities, churches, mosques, private homes." Holloway signed half the clearances herself. A long pause. Shasta stepped down. One judge finally said, "Or this whole system gets pulled into the light." The liaison raised an eyebrow. "And what happens when people start asking how deep the signatures go?" Nobody answered. That night, Bondi sat alone in her apartment, watching her old interviews replay on the news. The gold cross lay on the table beside her, next to her mother's last letter written years ago. After her name had appeared in the surveillance files, it read, "They're afraid of those who can't be bought. So be that woman, even if it costs you everything." Pam closed her eyes. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Malik. "Tomorrow's vote? Full Judiciary Panel review. They're running scared." But fear wasn't enough anymore. Pam opened her laptop, typed a name into a secured browser, and pulled up a contact file buried and encrypted. Archives. Name, Major Thomas Van Status, retired intel clearance. Still active, she sent a message. "Meet me tomorrow. It's time." Because what was coming wasn't just a trial. It was the reckoning. Washington buzzed like a hive rattled by smoke. Every major outlet had turned its lens toward Pam Bondi. Her press conference hadn't just cracked the surface. It had shattered the illusion of silence that had kept government surveillance programs hidden for over a decade. Overnight, she had gone from courtroom defendant to political detonator and Judge Margaret Holloway. She hadn't been seen in public since the morning news circuit. Her chambers at the D.C. courthouse remained closed. A handwritten note posted on the door read, "Adjourned until further notice." But Bondi knew this wasn't victory. Not yet. Because sealed inside a secure government archive, located 3 floors beneath the Library of Congress, was the one file no one dared to speak of. File ID V. 27 Trinity. It wasn't just about her mother. It contained details of an internal memo handwritten in 2006 by a special liaison between the NSA and the Office of Legal Counsel. outlining temporary suspension of religious protections in cases of elevated national interest. That memo, if found and verified, would prove beyond any courtroom doubt that multiple federal agencies had operated under an illegal doctrine, one approved by Judge Holloway herself. The next morning, Bondi met with Major Thomas Vance. He looked like a man carved out of the cold war square shoulders, cold eyes, and a voice that gave orders even when asking questions. He had once run intelligence briefings in Berlin. Now he drove a rusted black pickup truck and lived 3 hours outside the city. They sat across from each other in a quiet Georgetown cafe. No cameras, no aides, just history. "You're looking for Trinity," he said bluntly, before she could even ask. Pam nodded. "You knew about it." "I filed part of it," he replied. "Didn't know what it would become." Holloway was part of the Judiciary Review team that gave us backdoor clearance. Thought it'd be temporary. But once you build a machine like that, no one wants to shut it off. Bondi leaned forward. "Where is it now?" Vance slid a torn envelope across the table. Inside was a single access code and a GPS coordinate. "You've got until Friday. After that, they'll scrub it." 2 days later, in the middle of a thunderstorm, Pam Bondi stood at the edge of the archive's underground level. Her badge, issued after a sudden Federal Review Board vote, gave her limited entry. She used the code Vance had provided. Doors opened. Lights flickered on, row by row. She found the file buried in a temperature-controlled chamber, sealed behind glass and magnetic locks. Its contents were worse than she imagined. It detailed not only the names of individuals monitored under religious concern, but also training memos distributed to judges on how to neutralize courtroom displays of faith-based resistance. There, in clear legal writing, was a training bulletin from 2008, emotional displays tied to religious identity should be neutralized with procedural discipline. If the subject pushes back, use financial penalties. They escalate, cite courtroom neutrality. The objective is to maintain control and discredit faith-based emotional appeals before the press can frame them as civil rights issues. Pam's hands trembled. Below the memo, a list of judges who approved the policy. Holloway's name was not the only one. There were 12 others. The next morning, Bondi called for a public judiciary hearing and brought the original file to the Oversight Committee. The hearing, held in a tightly secured chamber, was broadcast live. Bondi stood before them with the cross once again around her neck. "I was fine not because of court decorum," she began. "I was fine because I wore proof of who my mother was, of who I am, and of a truth this system tried to bury." She turned to the panel of seated judges. "I'm here to ask one question. The law claims neutrality, but acts in silence. To destroy faith, is it still the law, or is it tyranny dressed in robes?" Gasps filled the room. Even the cameras zoomed in. A member of the panel, an elderly judge with trembling hands, whispered into the mic. I recognize that memo. I was briefed on it, but I never signed." Pam raised the file. 12 did. Another judge leaned forward. "Are you accusing this court of conspiracy?" "No," she replied. "I'm accusing it of cowardice." Outside the chamber, protesters had already gathered. Christians, Muslims, journalists, veterans, all carrying one sign. "You can fine us. You cannot silence us." Inside, the committee broke into recess. A vote was scheduled in 24 hours. Removal proceedings against Judge Holloway were on the table. But Bondi knew the system would try one last move before surrendering. Her phone buzzed. Secure number. Message: "They're moving her tonight. Not for her safety, for theirs. They're cleaning house. Get to her before they do." Pam closed her briefcase, adjusted the cross, and headed for the courthouse garage. Because the next part of this war wasn't going to be in court. It was going to be in the dark. The sky over Washington turned gray, as if the city itself had begun to understand what was coming. A thin drizzle coated the sidewalks, making them shine under the dull streetlights. Somewhere deep beneath the Capitol, Judge Holloway was being moved not for her protection, but for the protection of those still pulling strings behind the scenes. Pam Bondi had received the tip just in time. She knew this wasn't about legal strategy anymore. It was about who could expose the truth first and who could bury it forever. At 2:17 a.m., she pulled her car into the underground courthouse garage. There was no security checkpoint, no press, no onlookers, just silence. The kind that warns, you something is terribly wrong. She parked near a black government van. Its side doors were open, two agents standing beside them, faces unreadable. Inside the van, Judge Margaret Holloway sat cuffed, lips tight, eyes swollen from what looked like hours of interrogation. She didn't look like a powerful judge anymore. She looked like a witness a prisoner of the very system she had once helped protect. Pam stepped out of the car and approached slowly. One of the agents stepped forward, hand resting on his sidearm. "You're not cleared for this, Ms. Bondi." She didn't blink. "I have judicial oversight clearance. Emergency clause under Statute 43B. Want me to call the federal liaison on live television?" There was a long pause. The agent moved aside. Bondi leaned into the van. "They're not protecting you, Margaret. They're cleaning house. You're the easiest to remove. You know that." Judge Holloway met her gaze. "I didn't think it would go this far." Pam exhaled. "It already has." She handed Holloway a small digital recorder. "Tell them everything. Record it now. Names, memos, orders, all of it. This is your last shot to get ahead of it. If you don't, you're just another corrupt name on a forgotten headline." For a second, Holloway looked like she might argue. Then slowly her fingers curled around the recorder. At 6:30 a.m., Bondi uploaded the audio to 3 major networks and 1 international watchdog group. Within 15 minutes, headlines. Across the world lit up. Federal judge admits to secret. Religious suppression program. Pam Bondi unleashes judicial earthquake in D.C. Operation Trinity. Inside America's legal war on faith and the recording. It was brutal. Unfiltered, Holloway's voice trembled as she described. Confidential briefings from as far back as 2004. She spoke of hidden instructions, covert memos labeled with phrases like preemptive neutralization and emotional containment protocols. She even admitted that some judges were advised to fine or detain individuals, not because of legal violations, but to create optics of control. It was all out now. The Department of Justice released a rushed statement, calling for an emergency ethics investigation. But Bondi wasn't done. That afternoon, she filed a motion to freeze judicial appointments made by any judge listed in the Trinity memo until an independent panel could investigate. The request was denied, not because it lacked evidence, but because, as one source whispered to her later, "You're shaking the wrong pillars." Meanwhile, media pressure was exploding. Protesters lined the steps of the Supreme Court. Congress called for hearings. Pam's face was everywhere, praised by some as a whistleblower, attacked by others as a political opportunist. But none of it compared to what came next. That evening, she received a message from a private encrypted server. No sender, no metadata, just one sentence. "If you reveal the final name, you'll be signing your own removal." Attached was a file, encrypted. Pam knew what it was, the final signature on the original Trinity memo. The person who initiated it all. The person who had managed to stay hidden even from Holloway's confession. She opened it, stopped breathing. Because it wasn't a judge. It was a sitting U.S. senator. A senator currently leading the judiciary. Committee overseeing the very hearing sparked by her expose. That night, Bondi sat in her hotel room, staring out at the Capitol. Her phone buzzed, nonstop media, legal teams, allies asking for her next move. But she was silent. She now held a choice that would define the course of American law and maybe her own life. To expose the final name would mean taking on the Senate, the media establishment, the last wall of protection the system had built for itself. She opened her laptop, began drafting a speech. It would be delivered in 24 hours, live on every network. As she typed, her reflection in the window stared back, tired but not afraid. The words came slowly, but with fire. This is not a war against government. This is a war against silence. She didn't need permission anymore. She had the truth. And by morning, the world would have it too. The morning of the broadcast felt unlike any other in Washington. The city wasn't quiet, it was holding its breath. Pam Bondi walked toward the stage set inside the National Press Club. Cameras from every major network were aimed at the podium. Lights were harsh, unblinking. She didn't wear her usual pearl necklace, just the small gold cross from her mother, barely visible beneath the collar of her blazer. Backstage, her legal team, advisors, and a few trusted journalists stood in a half circle, watching her like someone preparing to detonate something powerful and irreversible. A countdown ticked down on the teleprompter. 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 10 seconds. Pam stepped into the light. She didn't start with greetings or thank yous. She looked into the camera, her voice steady but sharp. 20 years ago, a program was launched under the quiet name Trinity. You won't find it in any legal code, and yet its fingerprints are on hundreds of cases. It was designed to suppress expressions of faith inside federal institutions, but it didn't stop there. It became a machine for control, political, cultural, judicial. Murmurs erupted from the media pit. Last week, I stood in a courtroom and was fined for wearing a necklace. Today, that fine looks like the first domino. Then she reached for the folder beside her. Inside it was the document she had held for 36 hours. It had been verified by 4 cybersecurity labs and traced to the original Trinity meeting in 2004. She held it up. This is the signature that started it. The person who authorized the program, who built its framework, and who now chairs the Judiciary Committee investigating me. The room snapped into chaos. Reporters whispered the senator's name before she even said it out loud. Senator Calvin Dwyer. The feed from 2 major networks cut out instantly. Other broadcasts scrambled to stay online. Hashtags exploded across every platform. Hashtag Trinity Files, hashtag Bondi vs. Dwyer, hashtag Judicial Crisis. Pam didn't flinch. This isn't about left or right. It's about the lie that power can bury truth. About institutions that protect themselves first and the people second. And it ends here. She then did something no one expected. Something no lawyer, advisor, or a strategist told her to do. She read aloud from one of the classified memos obtained in Holloway's confession. The memo detailed how key public figures with visible religious symbols were to be preemptively discredited through legal procedures that appear unbiased. Pam let that line sit in the air like a verdict. Outside, hundreds of protesters had gathered, watching on huge outdoor screens. Some wore crosses. Others held signs with just one word: enough. At the Capitol, security was raised. Inside, Senator Dwyer's staff scrambled to issue a response. But it was too late. A bipartisan ethics committee had already convened an emergency session. Even members of Dwyer's own party were demanding answers. By noon, he was no longer leading the investigation. By evening, he had been placed under formal review. And Pam, she walked back into her hotel with no security, no statement, and no entourage. But something followed her anyway. The weight of what comes after truth is exposed. 3 days later, Judge Holloway was released under protection after testifying before a federal oversight board. Her confession triggered resignations in multiple districts. A deeper investigation into Trinity was launched, this time with full transparency under international observation. Churches across the country held quiet vigils for what they called the return of truth in the courtroom. Pam Bondi, though, disappeared from the media for a while. She wasn't interested in book deals, speaking tours, or even celebration, till one day, weeks later, she returned for one final interview. The journalist asked, "Do you think this story has a happy ending?" She smiled softly. "No, not happy, but honest. And sometimes that's the best we get." The interview aired late that night, just past midnight. And across the country, in living rooms and phones and quiet corners of faith, people listened. Not because she was famous, but because she had dared to speak when silence was the safer choice. The system wasn't healed yet, but now it was open, and truth had found its voice.